Hi, I'm Bill Whelan, and I'm a composer and a musician. Well, my first musical experience was very personal. I remember sitting on the floor beating a biscuit tin with two knives while my father played the harmonica. So it was, I suppose, in the home was where all my very early music experiences were. And then I remember, my father used to take me out to live gigs in Limerick. There were concerts which used to take place at the Savoy in Limerick. And those live gigs, the power of music in a live environment to engage an audience and to make an audience feel a sense of community with each other and also with the musicians on stage. Those moments really resonated for me when I was a kid, and I remember them very, very well. I mean, both my parents played music. My mother was a very good classical pianist, and I remember some of the earliest things listening to Beethoven on the piano. And then my father was completely different. He was not a trained musician, but he loved music in a very deep way. He played it on harmonica and used to noodle around on the piano as well. But more particularly, he also brought a lot of music into the house. So, again, my earliest experience would have been listening to jazz records. He brought a lot of jazz into the house. And then, even though he was a good bit older than me, he was 50 when I was born, he still bought what was happening at that time, so he bought like Bill Haley and Elvis Presley and stuff, and even stuff that I was too young to kind of really hook into. They were in the house. So then, when I started to really, music started to ignite for me, then I started to collect records. And the gramophone was it was interesting actually, given that nowadays the musical experience is very often a solitary one. In those early days of stereo, for instance, and early Beatle albums and stuff, we would all gather in somebody's house and just sit and listen for hours to Sergeant Pepper or Pink Floyd's The Wall or something, and just hours and hours of just guys and girls together enjoying music as a community experience. And I think that was really valuable. And even though most of my pals never went on to make a career out of music, this was the glue that kept us together as friends and gave us a kind of a social reference point that we felt that we could relate to. Recalling recently, I was a member of a record club called the Heener Record Centre, which were based in Middlesex. And you joined, you wrote away and you joined this club, and they sent you out a brochure every week, which was just very cheaply printed on kind of cheap paper, but it was a list of everything that was available in their upcoming releases. So you could pre-order stuff that was going to be out. So the result was that by a curious twist of this, I ended up having Sergeant Pepper about a week before everybody else in Limerick, and so it was so prized that there was a friend of ours whose father had a very, very good stereo system. So we brought the album up to his house to listen to it. But I nearly had an armed guard taking me up to the house with the early copy of Sergeant Pepper. And then we would listen to it endlessly. And there was a great sense of engagement with the artists. You just like now, you were, the groups that you admired were what kind of defined you in a way. And there were the Beatles fans and there were the Rolling Stones fans. They weren't necessarily the same people. And it was an exciting time. And then what was igniting in America, with the whole singer-songwriter thing and the whole, James Taylor, Paul Simon, all of these guys who were turning out music and starting to interact with musicians in a way where musicianship as well started to become important. So you were watching albums for who was playing on something, at least I was, and guys who were interested in music. But most people you were watching, you would browse through the, in the record store, you would go through the racks and start reading who was playing on the albums and who was producing the albums, and all these became, a kind of important collection of information about every artist, and that's what drew you to the artist. So it was an exciting time, and as I say, it was something that was enjoyed very much in the group. music as a career offered a kind of a grim vista, really. Um, you were either lucky enough to, you know, let's say grow up in a house full of musicians and you automatically sort of just, you know, collapsed into a career in music. Very often, for instance, like something like teaching, a lot of people wanted to go and do a BMUS degree and then go on and teach music. I wasn't particularly drawn to that. So for me, I was interested in performance music and I was interested in composition, you know, and writing. And I was writing songs from when I was in my early teens. I used to write songs. And, you know, so that drew me, but it wasn't really a real career option. It was, you know, my parents would have, at the time, while they were very encouraging to my enjoyment of music and to the value that music had in my life, they still didn't see it as a potential career. And really it was just, you just either went out and joined a show band or tried to get a job in one of the orchestras. And it seemed pretty well unattainable. For me, my progression towards music was always just totally magnetic. It was never, you know, I'm going to do this and then that's going to happen. It was just, I kept finding myself being drawn to the environments where music was being made. And even when I went on to do a degree which had nothing to do with music, I was still, you know, finding myself in the environment of music. I was turning up and knocking on the door of recording studios and asking them, could I, you know, would they listen to my demos? And, you know, all these things that you do which seem to have very little, they're not reality based, but they are drawing you towards what ultimately for me became the irresistible impulse to be a musician. And then I found myself playing with other musicians, joining groups and stuff, and then starting to get session work and ended up in recording studios. Of course, in those days there was a very big recording session music scene, and there was employment there for guys who would move from studio to studio. You know, you would start at 10 in the morning, you would play a session on somebody's record, and then that afternoon you would play on somebody else's record. And in those days we turned up, like there could be 10 of us turning up on a session, and we'd all sit in the studio and play together. And it was great. I mean, it was a great, very often you were playing something like a jingle or stuff. You wouldn't be overexcited musically by it. But nevertheless, there was that whole thing that you were continually kept in contact with musicians. You were continually talking to each other. When you went for a pint after a session, you would talk about music. It was the passion, and it occupied, for me, in my early life, it occupied virtually 24 hours of the day. When I was 19, I'd written a piece of music, or 18, I'd written a piece of music which we recorded in my drawing room back at home in Limerick, and it ended up being heard in London. I'd given the tape, cassette, or actually reel to reel, to some guy. This guy actually who was ended up working for CBS Records, and he started to kind of play it to a couple of people, and it ended up being heard by Richard Harris, the actor, who was looking for music for a film. And he heard this theme, which was just flute and piano, and he said, "This is the theme for my film." And he had no idea who I was or anything, and it turned out he was from Limerick as well. And so I ended up having this, at 19 years of age, having the music that I had written being the theme for a film, a feature film, which starred all kinds of people like Romy Schneider and Richard Harris himself and stuff. And it seemed to me at the time, I remember the local Limerick newspapers, had these articles about, local. In fact, I was writing with another guy who wrote lyrics for me. We wrote together, and there were photographs of us in the Limerick Leader saying that this was all happening. And it was, it was happening. And we did go, and I met all kinds of people like Shirley Bassey at the time, and Lulu and the Bee Gees, and it was like here I was suddenly in the music. My dream was being lived, and I was still in college. But of course, it didn't. It unfortunately wasn't a successful film, so nothing really happened after that. And then I was back to the reality of having to find my way through the music business. Well, working with Planxty was for me revelatory. It was, I had been attracted to the possibilities of traditional music, and I loved hearing players play and stuff. But I was on the fringes of it and not really involved. And then I I happened by chance to do a television program with Donal Lunny and Andy Irvine, and they called me subsequently and said would I come in and play on a Planxty album, and I did, and I played on the Planxty album, and suddenly we became friends musically, and then I was suddenly in the band. Planxty was in a period when Planxty had expanded from the original 4-piece into a 6-piece, and Noddy Casey was the fiddle player and I was the keyboard player, and we toured with the band and played on a couple of albums. And that to me was really important because it introduced me to traditional music in a way that, you know, I felt somewhat excluded from it, even though attracted by it. And this brought me in. This sort of gave me a handshake and said, come in and enjoy the music with us. That was tremendously generous at the time to me, and also very influential in what I was to do subsequently with music. Yeah, you know, again, you know, that time, let's say in the late 70s or early 80s, when I was kind of, I suppose, cutting my teeth in music, you know, I began to get work as an orchestrator and as an arranger. And so I was starting to arrange for the RTE Concert Orchestra and other ensembles. And every year the National Song Contest took place in Dublin. And I was asked, invariably every year I would get a commission to arrange one or two of the pieces. And so I ended up arranging and producing the albums for Johnny Logan. And, you know, he had the Eurovision winner with What's Another Year, Shea Healy's song. And I did the orchestration and produced the record for that. And then onwards I did more. I did a second Eurovision winner with Johnny Logan. You know, I did Terminal 3 with Linda Martin, and you know, I was, you know, those were the stable employers every year for guys like me who were freelance musicians and arrangers. And every year you would have a crop of work that would come up either for Eurovision or for RTE light orchestral programs or rock shows or whatever. So that's how we were employed. And in fact, you know, that kind of employment really, that regular musicians, you know, I never had a job. I was never employed, you know, by anybody. I was unemployable by anybody on a regular basis. But I had a lot of contract work, so I'd come in and do a TV show for RTE on contract for that show or something else. And that's how musicians survived in those days. In 1981, I had done the centerpiece of Eurovision with Planxty, with a piece called Time Dance. And when the opportunity came up again, some 13 years later in 1994, I called Riverdance because I wanted to make the connection with Time Dance. And because both of them involved traditional Irish music and dance, but not Irish dance. In the first case, it was balletic. In this case, in the first case, it was kind of contemporary dance. And in Riverdance, obviously, it was traditional Irish dance taken to a new place. For many people, Riverdance seems like a kind of explosion, and it is. I mean, it happened on that one night, and I often hear people say to me, oh, I remember where I was, you know, I was in such and such a pub, or we'd stopped to make the tea in Eurovision, and my uncle was there, and the hair stood up in the back of our neck. And it was, for all of us, it had that sort of cataclysmic, explosive moment that made it, that was to go on and have seismic, you know, echoes for a good many years. But also, what's often ignored in that is what led up to it. And it didn't just happen as an explosion to those of us who were involved. And for me particularly, you know, Riverdance would never have happened had I not done the Seville Suite 2 years previously, which involved Irish music, Irish dance, and Spanish dance. And all of those elements were in the Seville Suite in 1992. And then in 1993, I did The Spirit of Mayo, which again was a big orchestral piece with trad musicians, with choirs, with drums, with all of the things which were to eventually appear in Riverdance. So it was a progression. And responding to your question as to whether or not I or any of us knew that it was going to be, or did we have even a sniff or a sense that it was going to be what it was going to be? Well, the answer is not as much as it became. But we did certainly, and I certainly did have a sense when I saw it, in rehearsal, on our first day in rehearsal, when we came together with the band, the dancers, the singers, and we saw the whole thing together. Then I think most of us thought, this is turning out rather well, and then, you know, when in the week of Eurovision and the rehearsals were going on every day, you could feel the growing sense of excitement. You know, the centerpiece of Eurovision, nobody goes to those rehearsals, you know, because they've got their own stuff to worry about. The Israelis want to go to their rehearsals and meet the press and do all the other things, or go shopping. But suddenly, by the end of the week of Eurovision, everybody was at the Riverdance rehearsals. Everybody. I mean, all the other countries had come in just to see the rehearsals because the word had gone out. There was something happening. So people knew. But what we didn't know was that when it did eventually make it to the screen and was live on the night, that the response, both in the venue at the Point Theatre and all around Europe, was phenomenal. I mean, the phones just went off the hook. It was just, I mean, we all saw the response in the Point, but it was just something resonated for people. And it wasn't just Irish people. Irish people had a certain ownership of it. It was their music and their dance, so they had an ownership of it. But it was people who didn't really have that direct connection to it, for whom it resonated. Suddenly, you know, Norwegians were talking about this thing that they liked, and they weren't sure why they liked it, but they liked it. And I suppose that was the thing that none of us really were prepared for. In fact, I put my hands up and say that when we went to London in the first place with the show, eventually when I went on and wrote the full show, and then we took it to London, at that stage I thought we'd play in London for a couple of weeks to the Irish community in England, and then that would be it, we would go home. But no, we were to continue on, and we played continuously in Hammersmith in a big theatre for 2 years. I mean, it was just, it certainly wasn't on my radar. And every time, even up to the, you know, it's now 15, 16 years later, and even now I'm still surprised by some of the things. Like last year I was in Beijing doing a video and for the show, and in came 30 or 40 Chinese Irish dancers. Now, I didn't know there were 30 or 40 Chinese Irish dancers in Beijing, but there are, and it's growing. And you know, the way that the show has excited audiences and connected to audiences around the world has always been somewhat of a surprise and gratifying, you know. And it's so big now, it has happened so big, it's kind of moved into the kind of, you know, it's a kind of brand, and, you know, oh, Riverdance, and, you know, people say, oh, Riverdance, oh my God, you know. And, you know, there's a joke in the New Yorker that this judge was sentencing a guy, and the judge was explaining to the counselor, he said, "Counselor, would you tell your client that a community service and a custodial sentence are sentencing options?" He said, "Attending Riverdance is not a sentencing option." And it became so popular that it was almost, you know, not cool to like it. And I have to say, I relate to that. That's totally to be expected. However, even I still, when I haven't seen the show in a while, and I go and I see what the performers of Riverdance do on a nightly basis, and it's really gratifying. It's still, there are kids dancing Riverdance now who were 4 when I was writing it, and I go and I see them, and they're bringing a new energy. Not alone that, but the dance has developed since then. Musicianship has developed since then. There are people doing things now that weren't happening in 1994. That's really where the strength of it is. You know, I don't care whether people like it or not. What I do care about is that it is something that has stimulated musicians and dancers to stretch out a little bit and take it elsewhere. I'm more gratified going on and seeing something that is probably connected to it but not it. That's where you really see what the value is, that it's grown, that some new young dancer has now mixed Irish dance with contemporary dance and is doing something exciting. That's where it really works. You know, people imagine that Riverdance was some kind of, there were these great Svengalis behind Riverdance, who were kind of making this thing, this brand that was going to go out there. It wasn't. We did it because we loved doing it, and it was exciting to do. And then what happened out of all of that was the spin-offs that appeared. As you say, it was a part of the Irish image abroad that brought tourism in and did other things and connected people to Ireland and made people have a positive image of Ireland. That all of that we didn't plan, but all of that was good when it happened. And again, going back to China, as we were talking earlier, I mean, China, to me, it's been extraordinary how the show, when I went to China, it kind of had embedded itself in the public consciousness. They knew nothing about Ireland up to then, and then Ireland was kind of Riverdance and Roy Keane. That was suddenly, those are the things they knew about. Yeah, that was a big moment for me. Getting the Grammy was a big moment in itself, but what the cream on the cake was Quincy Jones presenting it to me, and subsequently, I've met Quincy Jones several times, and he was an idol for me. I mean, it was like getting it from Elvis. If you were a singer, Quincy Jones was somebody whose musical imagination, and his connection to jazz and his capacity to present jazz in a way that was so respectful of the form, and yet at the same time, bringing it out to a wide audience. That was, and then of course, obviously, his ability to work as a producer with everyone from Michael Jackson to all kinds of pop and rock acts. Quincy Jones is legendary, and he's, there's a great humility about Quincy Jones when you meet him. Like all good people who are involved in music, I think, who have been successful at it, if ego is very often not all that evident. You have to have a certain amount of ego to push forward, but there's a balance between where ego and the passion for music must actually not interfere with each other. And Quincy Jones is one of those persons who just loves music, loves what it did to him, and loves what he does to it. I think that we're in a very, very interesting time in terms of, where music stands in the world, what it means to us, and how we value it. And when I say value, I use both meanings of that word, both as a cultural and a social expression of our emotions and all of those aesthetic considerations that are involved in music, the value of that in society, in educating our children, in giving our children something that they can relate to and that they can feel, they can see a horizon when they hear music. It's a future, it's a horizon. It doesn't keep them down, it leads them forward. That's where music has a real value. It also has a value as well, which is to do with a commercial value. And that value must be passed back in some way to the creators. And what's happened with the internet and the whole debate about free content, I understand all that. To me, having that accessibility to content on the internet is absolutely, I use it all the time. It's totally valuable to me personally, and I think it's valuable to society. Where it gets a little bit muddy is where those people who need to earn a living from creating the music that becomes the content on the internet, that they are suddenly taken out of the picture. And that cannot happen. Not because, I'm a musician and I need to make a living, or my son is a musician and needs to make a living. Yes, that is true, but it's also because it creates an intimacy between, a social contract between me and my audience, between her singing her song and the people who come and listen to her, him playing his guitar and the people that turn up to hear him or buy their records. That connection can't be severed completely, so that so that the future of music is protected. Because otherwise we'll end up with a completely amateur industry, which some people may want. But for me, an industry which actually puts money back into its own self-generation is essential. And for people to realistically, as I had to do, look at making a career out of music. It's hard enough. If you take the possibility for earning out of it, then it becomes impossible and you have to do something else. I will have to go on and do what I was doing originally and do my law degree and then do music at the weekends, that kind of thing. And something will suffer, the law or the music, one of them. And I think that is the problem at the moment, is that we're not really seeing that, whatever about everything being free and all of that, that we do have to actually pay back to the people who do it so that the next thing will be even better. Not for any greedy reason, just for the reality of living. Playing music and playing with other musicians, recently I after a period of not doing it for a while because there were so many other things, I was either sitting on my own writing things or I was out working on, with the show or whatever. I had stopped actually playing, and recently I revitalized that and went back out, and I did a couple of concerts in New York, and I did one here at the National Concert Hall, and one in Galway and stuff, and I ended up back out playing with musicians again, and realizing how much I've missed that, and how important that is to me. That all of us there is a kind of a vibe, if you like. I know it's a bit airy-fairy, but there's a kind of a vibe that happens when musicians sit in a room together and they hear each other playing and they relate to each other's playing. That's really, it's kind of not possible to recreate in any other environment that I know of. And it's valuable because not alone is it good for the people who are sitting around together, it's kind of almost medicinal, but it's also good for the audience and they can enter into that experience. I guess I've missed that a little bit, and now that I've started doing it again and reconnecting to other musicians in a live way, I don't realize how much I've missed it. Music unquestionably changed my life at several times in my life. I mean, it was, I grew up on my own. I didn't have any brothers and sisters. So music to me was, not alone was it a social tool by which I got out and I met with other people and played with them and played in bands and sat in pubs playing guitar. But also it was a good activity for me to do on my own. When I felt lonely or isolated, music was always a friend. I could always sit down and play a couple of tunes on the piano or pick out a tune on the guitar or listen to an album. Music was always curative, and at times of stress and at times of even loss, when my parents died and all of that, I reached out to music in all of those times, and I have done always in my life, and it has never failed me. It's never disappointed me, and it's kind of like, it's a very high class dog. It's unconditionally comes back at you, and it's a companion, it's a mode of expression. And it is something that has turned me at various corners of my life. It has taken me around those corners safely. I think music at any time in your life is really important, but particularly important when you are young, and the earlier you get involved, the better. I say that with a slight I suppose caveat that some people Parents sometimes think, oh, I want my kid to be the best clarinet player in Tala. You know, um, your parents, you can't live out your parents' ambitions through your music, but music as something to broaden your mind, um, to help you to find a place in society as a young person is important. It is important, I think, increasingly for people to find activities that give them access to other young people in a way that isn't centered around so many of the other things that we organize our lives around now, like the pub, and that music can actually allow people to connect in a really visceral level without any of those other social or commercial things around them. So I think it's very, very important. Also, it has been proven that people who take up music at an early age have got easier mental access to other subjects. So that the child, for instance, who has taken up a whistle or a flute or whatever it is and has learned about music finds that he or she has easier access to other subjects. It's extraordinary, but it is true, and it has been found in research in other countries. In Finland, it has definitely appeared as such a positive gateway to other learning, just simply by having music.